The snow hit Birdie Hurst like a wall of white fury, and she had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether Reuben Ashford was going to live or die. He was slumped against the boulder, his face a terrible shade of gray beneath the frost that clung to his beard, his right leg bent at an angle that made her stomach clench. The blizzard screamed around them with the full-throated rage of a January storm in the Wyoming territory, and every trail she had memorized over 7 years of riding this country had simply vanished beneath 4 feet of drifting snow. The pine trees were black smears in a world gone entirely white. The compass in her coat pocket was useless. The landmarks were buried. The horses were gone, spooked by the avalanche that had thundered down off the ridge an hour ago and scattered everything she owned across a mountainside she could no longer see. The man who had put her in irons 2 days ago was now completely dependent on her to survive. That felt like the bitterest kind of justice, and Birdie Hurst had never been a woman who savored bitterness. She pressed 2 fingers against his throat and felt the pulse there, slow and uneven but present. His eyes cracked open, and even half-conscious and frozen, Reuben Ashford's gaze was the most unsettling shade of amber she had ever encountered, the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and they looked at her now with a confusion that was rapidly ceding to pain. "Still alive, Outlaw," he managed, and his voice was gravel and smoke. "Still alive, Marshal," she said, "though you are doing your level best to fix that." She did not wait for his response. She turned her back on him and looked up, and even through the swirling chaos of the storm, she did what she had been doing since she was 9 years old, what her father had taught her in the high desert of New Mexico before the betrayal that had torn her life apart. She looked for the stars. Most people would have seen nothing. Most people would have seen only gray darkness and the howling erasure of the blizzard overhead. But Birdie Hurst did not look for stars the way most people did. She looked for the mathematics of them, the pattern beneath the pattern, the way certain thicknesses of cloud moved differently than others, the way the magnetic pull of the North Star expressed itself even through solid overcast if you knew how to read the wind, the temperature differential, the grain of the snow crystals themselves. She had a secret. She had always had a secret. And right now that secret was the only thing standing between them, and freezing to death on a nameless ridge in the Wyoming winter of 1882. She had to get them both down off this mountain. She had to do it blind, with a wounded man who technically had a warrant with her name on it folded in his coat pocket, and she had to do it tonight. She turned back to Reuben Ashford, took a breath of air so cold it hurt her teeth, and said, "I need you to stand up." He stared at her. "That leg is not broken," she said, though she had not examined it and did not know that for certain. "It is bruised badly. I can see from the way you are sitting that you still have weight on the hip. If it were broken the way you are positioned, you would be screaming." He kept staring. "I know where we are," she said. "I know which direction will take us down to the Clearwater Line cabin, which is 7 miles from here. I need you upright and moving, or we are both going to freeze to death on this ridge, and I did not survive the last 6 years to die in a blizzard with a federal marshal." "You know where we are," he repeated slowly. "There is no trail visible. There are no landmarks visible. There is nothing visible except snow and darkness, and you know where we are." "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with a grunt of pure stubbornness, Reuben Ashford put his good leg under him and stood up. 2 days earlier, the sky above the Wyoming territory had been the particular shade of blue that exists only in January at elevation, that high cold color that looks almost brittle, like you could tap it and it would ring. Birdie had been riding the eastern edge of the Absaroka Range on a chestnut mare she had named Cora, following a game trail that angled down toward the Wind River Valley, and she had been completely, deliberately, entirely alone. Alone was something she had gotten very good at over the past 6 years. Alone was what happened when the man you trusted most in the world sold information about your father's location to a bounty hunter for $200, and your father died with his boots on in an alley in Laramie while you were 3 days' ride away. Alone was what happened after that, when the grief curdled into something harder and sharper, when you started making choices that put your name on federal papers. Not because you were cruel, not because you enjoyed it, but because the system that had failed your father and your family was staffed by men who would sell a good man's life for $200, and Birdie Hurst had decided early that she was not going to let that system feed off her passively. She had been wanted for 4 years. For robbery, yes, but the specific targets of her robberies were a matter of public record among those who paid attention. She had never once robbed a settler, a farmer, a traveler of ordinary means. She had taken from the land offices that falsified claim documents. She had taken from the railroad company payrolls that were built on broken treaties and broken backs. She had taken from the specific men and the specific institutions that had taken from people who had no legal recourse, and she had redistributed what she took with a methodical precision that had earned her a nickname in 2 territories. They called her the Cartographer because she always knew where she was going, and she always found a way through. She had not, in 4 years of successful operations, ever been caught. Reuben Ashford had caught her. She still was not entirely sure how he had done it. She had been careful, she had been more than careful, she had been meticulous. But he had appeared out of the tree line at the mouth of the canyon she was transiting, alone and mounted on a big gray horse, and before she could change direction he had already spoken. "Birdie Hurst," he had said in that voice, that low, even voice that carried no performance in it whatsoever. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest. I would rather not shoot you, and I would rather not be shot. I am asking you to consider the mathematics of the situation." She had considered the mathematics. He had a Winchester rifle and a clear line. She had a pistol and a bad angle. The situation was unambiguous. She had raised her hands. He had come forward on the gray horse, and she had studied him while he approached because Birdie Hurst studied everything. It was the only way she had survived this long. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulder in a way that suggested genuine physical labor rather than the kind of artificial bulk some men performed. He wore a canvas duster the color of tobacco, and his hat was pulled low against the January light. His face, when she got a clear look at it, was the face of a man who had spent considerable time outdoors in difficult weather. There were lines at the corners of those amber eyes that she refused to find compelling. There was a jaw that was set with the quiet certainty of someone who did not make threats he was not prepared to keep. He was, she assessed rapidly, around 30 years old. He was not accompanied by deputies, which was unusual and either very arrogant or very capable. He wore his badge on the inside of his coat rather than the outside, which told her he was not performing his authority but simply exercising it. She had disliked him immediately and completely. "Marshal," she had said, keeping her voice level, "I am going to need to know who you are." "Reuben Ashford," he had said, "United States Deputy Marshal out of the Cheyenne office. Are you alone?" "I am." That was either very brave or very foolish. The corner of his mouth had moved, not quite a smile, something that acknowledged the comment without granting it full concession. "I tracked you for 19 days, he had said. "I know your patterns, you work alone. You do not appreciate large pursuits because they are imprecise and loud. I thought you would respect a single clean approach." She had felt something odd at that, something she had not named at the time. A flicker of being genuinely seen by someone who had paid close enough attention to understand something real about her. She had quickly suppressed it. "The irons are in my saddlebag," he had said. "I would like you to put them on yourself. I think that will be less unpleasant for both of us than the alternative." She had looked at him for a very long moment. "Where are you taking me?" she had asked. "Cheyenne," he had said. "There is a circuit court sitting in February. You will have a fair hearing." She had heard that before about courts in this territory, and the word fair had a complicated history. But she had looked at the rifle and the angle and the mathematics, and she had put the irons on herself. They had traveled northeast for a day and a half before the sky went wrong. She had noticed it before he did. She had noticed it the moment she woke on the second morning, while the stars were still visible, because the stars were telling her something she did not want to hear. The temperature had dropped sharply in the pre-dawn hours, which in itself was not unusual for January in the territory. But there was a specific behavior in the wind, a shifting that happened in the high branches of the pines that told her something massive was coming down from the north. She had laid there in her blankets with her wrists bound and watched the sky and done calculations. "Marshal," she had said. He had been awake. He seemed, she noted, to always be awake when she thought he was asleep. "I see it," he had said, which surprised her because most men she encountered would not have seen it yet. Most men would not have seen it for another 2 hours. "The ridge trail is going to close," she had said. "If we push hard this morning, we can make the lower valley before it hits." "I know this country," he had said, with a tone that did not quite dismiss her but did not quite accept her assessment either. She had bitten down on a sharp reply and let it go. They had pushed hard. They had not made the lower valley. The storm had come down off the north face of the mountains with a speed that was simply catastrophic, and the world had gone white and furious in the space of 20 minutes. The horses had panicked when the leading edge of the avalanche thundered off the ridge above them, a massive rolling thunder of snow and ice that did not reach them directly but came close enough to blow ice crystals like buckshot through the air and hit the horses broadside with a concussive pressure wave. Cora had bolted. The gray had followed. Reuben had been thrown when his horse lurched sideways off the trail, and he had hit the boulder with his right leg and gone down hard. Birdie had landed in a snowdrift that had saved her from serious injury, but in the fall the key to her irons had gone with Reuben's coat into the snow somewhere, and she had spent 20 frantic minutes digging before she found it. By the time she got her wrists free, the visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and here they were. She got him upright and got his arm across her shoulders, and she took his weight without comment because comment was not useful and she was calculating as she walked. She had her father's old brass transit compass in her inside coat pocket, and she took it out now with her free hand, but she did not look at it for direction the way most people would. She looked at it as a temperature instrument, watching the way the needle hesitated at certain orientations, because a compass in a magnetic field is also a small measure of something else entirely when you know what else to look for. But mostly, she was reading the snow. This was her particular genius, the skill she had developed and refined over 7 years of navigating the wilderness of the American West alone, the thing that had made her the cartographer in fact as well as name. She could read snow and wind and star sign, and the lay of the land through purely sensory information in a way that approached something almost uncanny to anyone who witnessed it. Her father, who had been a surveyor and an astronomer and a deeply practical man of science, had spent her entire childhood teaching her the principles of celestial navigation as applied to the frontier. He had taught her to read the grain of wind-blown snow to determine prevailing wind direction. He had taught her to measure the temperature differential between north and south-facing slopes by the texture of the packed ice. He had taught her to locate herself on an internal map using the angle and character of observable starlight, even through significant cloud cover, using the brightness and color temperature of what filtered through as a proxy for the star's actual position. She was, in short, a human instrument of navigation, and she had never been truly lost in her life. The dark past of that skill was her father. Every time she used it, she felt him walking beside her. Every time the stars cooperated through a break in the clouds and she found Polaris in the gap, she heard his voice in her memory, steady and precise, saying the old mnemonic he had invented for her when she was 9 years old. "Find the fixed point first, Birdie, and everything else in the sky will introduce itself from there." She found it now, a gap, 3 seconds wide in the racing clouds overhead, and the North Star burned through it like a nail of light. She adjusted their direction by 11 degrees and pushed forward. Reuben felt it. She could tell from the slight resistance of his body, the way he was used to being the one who directed movement, the one who made navigational decisions. He was not a man who surrendered authority easily. But he was also, she was discovering, a man who observed facts clearly when they were in front of him, and the fact in front of him right now was that she was moving with absolute conviction through a blinding blizzard with no visible trail and no apparent reference points, and she had not hesitated once. "How are you doing that?" he asked. His voice was strained with the effort of movement and the pain in his leg, but the question was genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Celestial navigation," she said, "and ground reading. My father was a surveyor and astronomer. He taught me to use environmental proxies when direct observation is obscured." He was quiet for several steps. The wind screamed over them and she adjusted their angle slightly, reading the texture of the snowpack under her boots, feeling the subtle tilt of the slope. "I know every deputy and tracker in the Wyoming territory," he said. "I know a man in Laramie who is paid specifically to know about skills like the one you are describing, and no one has ever mentioned this about you. No one who has seen me use it has ever been in a position to mention it," she said. He processed that. "Because they never caught you," he said. "Correct. Until tonight." "Until 2 days ago," she corrected. "Tonight is rather a different situation." She felt something shift in him. Not just the physical acknowledgement of pain and cold and the need to lean on her, but something interior, some reordering of assessment. She had been a fugitive to him, a target, a name on a warrant. She could feel him adjusting the category. She did not know how she felt about that. They walked for what felt like a very long time and was probably an hour and a half. The snow did not relent. It came at them horizontally in gusts that hit like handfuls of grit, and the temperature was dropping steadily, and Birdie tracked it all with the cold part of her mind, while the rest of her mind was occupied with the problem of Reuben Ashford's weight and the tenderness in her own left shoulder, where she had hit the snowdrift harder than she had initially assessed. He did not complain. She had expected from a man of his obvious pride and physical self-sufficiency some form of complaint, some masculine restlessness at the indignity of being helped. Instead, he moved with her in a way that was almost cooperative, putting his weight where she directed, stopping when she stopped, moving when she moved. He was treating the situation as a tactical problem to be solved jointly, which she found, despite everything, to be the correct response. "You tracked me for 19 days, she said, into a momentary lull in the wind. "Yes," he said. "Alone. Yes. Most marshals would have brought a posse for someone on a federal warrant." "Most marshals would have missed you entirely," he said. "You are not taken by posses. You hear them coming and you are gone. I read the reports on your previous escapes. You consistently evaded numbers. I thought a single tracker with patience had a better probability." She considered that. "You were right," she said. "I am sometimes," he said, and despite everything, despite the cold and the pain and the impossible situation, she heard something in his voice that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it, warm and dry and entirely unexpected. "Why do you care?" She asked, and she had not meant to ask it, but the cold and the darkness and the intimacy of their physical situation had lowered some guard she normally maintained at an absolute level. "About catching me specifically. There are worse men than me operating in this territory. There are men who do actual harm to actual people. Why spend 19 days on me?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. "Because the men I was told to bring in before you," he said finally, "were exactly the kind of men you are describing, and I brought them in." And 3 of them walked out of the Cheyenne courthouse with their cases dismissed because of who they knew and who they paid. And I decided the next person I went after was going to be someone where the law was being applied actually rather than selectively. She stopped walking, not because the ground required it, because what he had just said hit her somewhere she had been keeping carefully armored for 6 years. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that you tracked a woman who has never harmed a civilian because the corrupt men were getting dismissed anyway. I am telling you the law has to mean something consistent or it means nothing," he said. "I did not say it was comfortable." She stood there in the blizzard with this federal marshal's arm across her shoulders, and she felt something frightening move through her chest. Not anger, not the old sharp grief that had driven her for 6 years. Something else. Something that felt like the terrible, dangerous possibility that this man might be, against all probability and all her experience with men who carried badges, someone who was actually trying. She started walking again. "My father's name was Calvin Hurst," she said, and she never said this to anyone. She had not said it aloud in years. "He was a surveyor and astronomer. He was hired by the federal government to conduct boundary surveys in the New Mexico Territory in 1874. During that survey, he documented evidence of systematic land fraud being conducted by a group of men connected to the Santa Fe Ring. He attempted to report it through official channels. He was told to falsify his survey documents. He refused. 2 years later, someone sold his location to a bounty hunter for a fabricated reward. He died in a Laramie alley in 1876. I was 21 years old. The wind howled. They walked. "I read your file," Reuben said after a long silence. "Your full file, not just the warrant sheet." There was a notation in it from a deputy in Santa Fe who suspected a connection to the ring. That deputy was transferred to a posting in the Dakota Territory shortly afterward. "Hidden motives always leave traces," she said, "if you know what to look for. Your father taught you that too." "My father taught me everything useful I know," she said, and her voice was steady because she had practiced steadiness for 6 years, but the grief was there underneath it, constant and structural as bedrock. The stars and the surveyor's mathematics, and the way that institutions reveal their corruption through the patterns of what they suppress. "Birdie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it with every nerve ending she possessed. "What you have been doing for 4 years, the targets you have selected, the land office in Casper, the railroad company payroll in Green River, the specific gentlemen associated with specific fraudulent land claims in 3 territories. I need you to understand that I already knew about most of it before I came after you." She stopped again. "You knew. I knew. I had a file. And you came anyway." "I am an officer of the court," he said. "I cannot selectively enforce the law based on whether I agree with the targets. That is the same corruption you are fighting, just pointed in a different direction." She looked at him in the darkness and the blizzard, at the snow in his beard, and the pain in those amber eyes, and the absolute unflinching honesty with which he was saying something that she hated and could not argue with, and she felt something she had not felt in 6 years. She felt the specific kind of anger that comes not from disagreement, but from being forced to respect someone you are not ready to respect. "We can have this argument when we are not in immediate danger of freezing to death," she said. "That seems reasonable," he said. She found them a crack in the rock face 40 minutes later, a wind lee that was partially sheltered by an overhang, barely deep enough to call a cave but deep enough to break the worst of the wind. She got him situated against the back wall and took stock of what they had between them. 2 canteens, both partially frozen, a knife at her belt, a small packet of salt jerky in her coat pocket that she had completely forgotten about. His rifle had gone with the horse, but he still had the Colt at his hip, which she had very consciously not made any move toward despite several opportunities, both because taking it would have been a betrayal of the implicit truce their situation had created, and because she did not need it. He also had a box of matches in his breast pocket and a small journal with a pencil tucked in its spine. The journal caught her eye. She did not ask about it. She gathered dead branches from under the lee of the overhang where the snow had not fully penetrated, and she built a fire with the precise economy of someone who had done it 1,000 times in difficult conditions. She used a technique her father had shown her for sheltered fires in wind, building a small wall of flat rocks to protect the base of the flame, feeding it carefully with graduated sizes of wood, and within 15 minutes she had something that was genuinely warm. Reuben watched her do all of it without comment. She was beginning to understand that silence was his primary mode when he was thinking hard, and right now his amber eyes were following her with an attention that was so focused and so complete that she felt it against her skin even when her back was turned. She sat down across the fire from him, close enough for the warmth to matter, but with the fire between them. It felt like a boundary that was simultaneously practical and symbolic. "Let me look at that leg," she said. "It is fine," he said. "It is not fine," she said. "I need to know if you will be ambulatory in the morning because our survival plan depends on you being able to walk approximately 7 miles. He looked at her for a moment and then extended his leg. She moved around the fire and crouched beside him and examined it with careful hands, reading the swelling and the heat and the angle of his joint with the same methodical precision she applied to reading snow. He went very still while she worked, and she was aware in a way she was trying hard not to be aware of the fact that she had her hands on him, of the solidity of him, of the way he breathed slowly and controlled while she pressed and assessed. "It is a deep bruise to the quadricep," she said, sitting back. "Possible minor damage to the lateral knee joint. You will be stiff and sore tomorrow, but you can walk on it." "You have medical training," he said. "My father had a comprehensive library," she said. "I have spent a lot of time alone with books." She paused. "And I have dealt with injuries in the field before, my own and others." "Others," he said. "Your crew." "I work alone," she said with some emphasis. "But the people I have redistributed funds to include several families in genuinely difficult circumstances. Sometimes that involves practical assistance of more than one kind." He was quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the mountain. "The Gutierrez family in Casper," he said slowly, as if he was working something out. "After the land office robbery. The Gutierrez family received enough money to pay their fraudulent back taxes and retain their homestead claim." She looked at the fire. "There was no official connection established," she said carefully. "No," he said, "but I am a tracker. I notice patterns." 19 days, she said softly. "You learned a great deal about me in 19 days. "I tried to," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of those 3 words, something in the quiet directness of them that went somewhere she had not intended anything to go. She lifted her eyes from the fire and found his amber gaze already there, watching her with an honesty that was almost unbearable. "Why?" she asked, and she was not asking about the manhunt. He seemed to know that. He took a breath of cold air and let it out slowly. "Because the person I was tracking," he said, "was the most interesting person I had encountered in 12 years of this work. And because somewhere around day 7 I started to understand that what I was doing was legally necessary and morally complicated, and I wanted to understand the complication fully before I completed the assignment." She stared at him. "That is a very strange thing for a federal officer to say," she said. "I am a frequently strange federal officer," he said. "My supervisor in Cheyenne finds it deeply frustrating." She laughed. She had not meant to. It came out of her like something escaped, short and genuine, and the surprise of it crossed her own face before she could control it. His expression changed when she laughed, something opening in it that had been very carefully closed before, some warmth that she suspected he did not display easily or often. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said, and she had no idea why she said it. "Something that is not in whatever file you have been building about me." He considered this with the seriousness he appeared to bring to everything. "I grew up in Tennessee," he said. "My family had a small farm. I left at 18 because I wanted to see what was on the other side of the mountains, and when I got to the other side of the mountains I kept going, and eventually I ran out of continent and became a federal officer because it was a way to keep moving and have it mean something." He paused. "I have not been back to Tennessee in 12 years. I think about going back sometimes. I do not know what is keeping me from it." "What is on the farm now?" she asked. "My younger brother and his family," he said. "3 children the last I heard. He writes me letters that I answer badly and infrequently." "You should write him better letters," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should do a number of things I do not do." The fire settled between them. She pushed a branch further into the coals. The blizzard outside went through a particularly violent surge and then dropped slightly in intensity, the way big storms often did in their middle phase before building again. "I need to sleep for a few hours," she said. "The storm will quiet before dawn and I want to start moving at first light. Can you keep this fire going?" "I can," he said. She settled herself against the rock wall, pulling her coat tighter around her, and she looked at him one more time across the fire. He was looking back at her with that steady amber gaze, and the firelight found the angles of his face, the clean lines of his jaw and cheekbones, and she made herself look away. "Birdie," he said very quietly. "Yes," she said. "The warrant," he said. "I want you to know that I intend to conduct this with complete legal propriety. I'm not going to make promises I cannot keep about what happens in Cheyenne, but I will tell you that I do not believe the outcome is necessarily what you fear it is." She closed her eyes. "Good night, Marshal," she said. "Good night," he said. She slept for 3 hours and dreamed of her father, of a clear winter night in New Mexico with the entire sky spread above them like an invitation, her father's hand on her shoulder and his voice in her ear, pointing out the fixed points first and letting everything else in the sky introduce itself. She woke to Reuben adding the last of the wood to the fire and the storm beginning to ease. The dawn that came over the Wyoming mountains was the kind of dawn that follows a great violence, pale and still and immaculate, the landscape transformed into something entirely new. The snow was 4 feet deep on the flat and drifted into impossible curves and cornices along the rock faces, and everything familiar had been buried and remade. The air had a quality of silence that was total and absolute, the silence that happens when all sound has been insulated by deep, fresh snow. Birdie stood at the mouth of their shelter and breathed it in and looked at the sky, and the sky was perfectly clear now, the storm having scrubbed it to an impossible blue that was already deepening toward cobalt at the zenith. The sun was just breaking over the eastern ridge and painting the snowfield before them in shades of rose and amber that were, objectively and despite the danger of their situation, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. She heard Reuben come to stand beside her, and she did not turn. "All right," he said, looking at the buried, featureless landscape. "Show me how you know where we are." She took the brass transit compass out of her pocket and held it flat on her palm. "This is a conventional compass," she said, "magnetic north, but watch the needle." She turned slowly in a specific direction. "You see how the needle behavior changes slightly with ambient temperature." My father modified this compass to be more responsive than standard, with a finer needle bearing. When I orient northeast toward where the valley should be, the needle oscillates by a fraction that is measurable. That oscillation corresponds to the magnetic field differential that exists between exposed ridge rock and the valley floor, because the rock composition differs and the temperature gradient between them produces a measurable electromagnetic variance. He stared at the compass. He stared at her. Then he looked back at the compass. "That is," he said slowly, "the most extraordinary piece of field navigation theory I have ever encountered in my life." "My father developed it in the field during the New Mexico survey," she said. "He never published it because the survey results were suppressed with everything else he produced." She paused, and the grief was clean and steady in her voice. "I have been using his methods for 7 years. "Show me the rest of it," he said. There was something in his voice that was different now from anything she had heard from him yet. The marshal's authority was still there, deep and structural. But above it was something new, pure, transparent admiration, not condescension, not the qualified appreciation of a man who is surprised that a woman can do something. Pure admiration between 2 intelligent people, one of whom has just witnessed something the other has done that is genuinely remarkable. She showed him. She showed him the snow grain reading, crouching to demonstrate the texture differential between north-facing and south-facing crystals at this specific elevation. She showed him the shadow angles from the sunrise and the calculation they allowed. She showed him the way she cross-referenced these with her internal map of this mountain range. which she had ridden enough times in enough seasons that she carried a detailed mental geography of it as accurate as most printed maps and more accurate than many. He watched all of it with complete and focused attention, asking precise and intelligent questions, absorbing every answer. He had, she realized, the same quality of mind that she associated with her father, a genuine delight in how things worked, combined with the practical intelligence to apply what he understood immediately and concretely. The warmth that was developing in her chest toward Reuben Ashford was becoming a serious problem. "We need to move," she said, standing up. 7 miles. You lead with your good leg and I will manage the pace. You are going to navigate, he said. It was not a question, it was an acknowledgement. Yes, she said. Then I will follow your lead, he said, and the simplicity with which he said it, the complete absence of ego or resistance or the need to qualify it, went through her like something electric. They moved out into the white morning. The 7 miles took most of the day. The snowpack was deep and difficult, and Reuben's legs slowed them on the uphill sections. Though he never asked for a stop he did not genuinely need and never accepted more help than was functionally necessary. They fell into a rhythm of movement and communication that felt, despite everything, remarkably natural. She would call an adjustment, he would make it. She would read the terrain ahead and describe what she saw. He would confirm her assessment with his own observation when he could and defer to hers when he could not. He told her about 12 years of working the frontier territory, about cases that had gone well and cases that had gone wrong, and the specific moral erosion that happened to good people when they worked in systems that were unreliable. He spoke with a directness that she associated with people who had thought hard about difficult things rather than avoided them. And he spoke about the failures of the institutions he served with the same honesty he brought to everything else. She told him about the years after her father's death, about the specific cold decision she had made at 23, sitting alone in a rooming house in Cheyenne with her father's surveying instruments in her lap and nothing in her future that she could see clearly, to use what she knew how to do in the service of what she believed. She told him about the first job, the land office in Casper, how her hands had shaken the entire time and how that had never happened again. She told him about the people she had helped and the satisfaction of that, which was different from the satisfaction her father had found in honest government work, smaller and more temporary and less clean, but real. He listened to all of it. "You know what is going to happen in Cheyenne," she said at one point when they were resting on a fallen log and eating the last of the salt jerky. "They are going to find me guilty and put me in a territorial prison. I'm not naive about it." "You might be surprised," he said. "Reuben," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt them both notice it, and she pressed on because stopping would give it too much weight. "I have done what I have done. I do not regret most of it, but I am not going to pretend the legal reality is different than it is. I have a file," he said, "a complete file, not just the warrant sheet. The full file that documents what your father found, what was suppressed, what happened to the people who were defrauded, and what has been recovered because of your specific actions over 4 years. He paused. "I intend to present that file to the circuit court in February. I have a legal argument to make about the specific context of the charges. I cannot promise the outcome, but I can promise the argument will be made." She stared at him. "You compiled evidence in my defense," she said. "I compiled the full picture," he said, "which happens to include substantial evidence in your defense, yes." "Why?" she asked. And then, because she could hear the real question in her own voice, and she did not want to be evasive about it. "Why would you do that?" He looked at her with those amber eyes, steady and warm in the cold light off the snow, and he said, "Because somewhere in 19 days of tracking you, Birdie Hurst, I stopped tracking a fugitive and started trying to understand a person. And the person I came to understand is the most principled individual I have encountered in this work. And the law is supposed to serve principle, not ignore it." She was quiet for a long time. "You are going to be very difficult to remain appropriately hostile toward," she said finally. He smiled. Fully for the first time. It transformed his face completely, erased the marshal's gravity and replaced it with something open and young and warm, and she felt herself smile back before she could stop it. "I am not asking you to be hostile," he said. "I am asking you to trust me enough to see what happens in Cheyenne." "I do not trust easily," she said. "I know," he said. "You would not have survived 4 years if you did. I am asking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. The snow glittered around them in the afternoon light. A raven called somewhere in the pines. The world was completely silent and completely beautiful. "7 more miles to Cheyenne," she said, "after we reach the line cabin." "Give or take," he said. "All right," she said. And she meant it about the court and about the trust and about everything she was not saying yet, but that was building in her chest like a thaw coming in, slow and inevitable and fundamentally altering the landscape. They reached the Clearwater line cabin as the afternoon light went red and horizontal over the snow. It was a small structure, solidly built, stocked with the basic supplies that the ranch hands who used these high pastures in summer kept for emergency purposes. There was dry wood stacked inside, a small stove, a supply of canned goods and dried provisions, and best of all, 2 dry blankets that smelled of cedar and were folded neatly on the single narrow bunk. There was also, in the corner, a spare horse halter and rope. Birdie built a fire in the stove while Reuben lowered himself onto the bunk and stretched his damaged leg out with a controlled exhalation that was the closest thing to pain he had allowed himself to express all day. The small space warmed quickly, and the contrast between the brutal cold outside and the gathering warmth inside made everything feel slightly unreal, softened at the edges. She opened a tin of beans and set it on the stove to heat. She found coffee and heated water for it. These simple domestic acts, performed in a space no bigger than 8 feet by 10, in the company of the federal officer who had arrested her, and was also, against every rational expectation, becoming someone she wanted to know more completely, felt both ordinary and extraordinary, 2 things simultaneously. She brought him coffee and sat across from him in the single wooden chair. "Your father," he said, "what was he like, apart from the science?" She wrapped both hands around her own tin cup and felt the warmth of it. "He was funny," she said, "quietly funny. He had a very dry sense of humor that you could miss if you were not paying attention. He told terrible mathematical jokes that were actually clever if you worked them out. He was patient to an almost impossible degree, except with dishonesty, which he found genuinely offensive in a way that went right to the bone." She paused. "He was the best person I have known." "He sounds like someone who did not deserve what happened to him," Reuben said. "No," she said simply. "He did not." "Neither did you," he said. She looked up from her coffee. "I made my own choices," she said. "I will own them." "You can own your choices and still have had something done to you that was wrong," he said. "Those are not mutually exclusive. You were 21 years old and someone murdered your father by proxy for doing the right thing, and the system that should have protected him did the opposite. That is a wrong thing that happened to you. The choices you made afterward are yours. Both can be true." She felt the sting behind her eyes that she had not felt in years, and she did not look away from him, because she had decided some time in the last 12 hours that she was not going to perform steadiness with Reuben Ashford, that the pretense of it would be an insult to whatever this was becoming. "You are surprisingly good at this," she said, with a slight unsteadiness in her voice that she did not try to correct. "At what?" he asked. "At saying the true thing plainly," she said. "Most people cannot do it. They dress everything in qualification or they avoid the point entirely. You just say the thing. It is more efficient," he said. And then, with that same warm quiet that she was starting to recognize as his particular version of tenderness, "I learned early that the most important things deserve the clearest possible language." They ate the beans and drank the coffee, and the stove made a sound like a contented animal. At some point, the conversation shifted from the formal to something without a name, the kind of talking that happens between 2 people who are discovering that the shape of one mind fits unexpectedly well against the shape of the other. who find in the other person a quality of attention and intelligence and honesty that they had stopped expecting to find. He told her about Tennessee and the farm and the mountains he had crossed to get here, and what he had found on the other side of them. She told him about New Mexico before everything changed, about summer nights with her father on a high mesa looking at the sky, about the surveying journeys she had accompanied him on as a girl, sleeping under stars so bright they cast actual shadow. They talked until the fire in the stove burned low, and neither of them moved to add more wood because neither of them wanted to interrupt what was happening. At some point she said, "We should sleep," and he said, "Yes," and neither of them moved for another half-hour. When she finally moved to take her blanket and the chair, he said quietly, "Birdie." She turned. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I want to tell you before we reach Cheyenne because once we are there things will become official and complicated and there will be less room for truth-telling." She stood very still. "I have spent 12 years alone," he said, "by choice and by the nature of this work. I have encountered many people, and I have respected some of them, and I have cared about very few of them in any way that meant something real. In the last 4 days, in the middle of a blizzard and an arrest and a survival situation that I did not manage well, I have found myself caring about you in a way that is very real and that I am not confused about." He held her gaze steadily. "I am not asking you to say anything back. I am not asking you to feel anything. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know it, and because my father raised me to say true things clearly." The fire popped. Snow settled on the roof. She crossed the small space and sat on the edge of the bunk, close enough that she could see every line in his face and the steadiness in his eyes and the slight tension in his jaw that told her this honesty had cost him something. "I have not trusted anyone since my father died," she said. "I have been entirely, deliberately alone for 6 years. I have been good at it. I have arranged my life so that it requires no one." She paused. "And somewhere in the last day and a half, something has shifted that I cannot make unshift, and I find I do not want to." He looked at her with those amber eyes, and in them she saw something she had stopped believing she would find. A man who was looking at the real her, all of it, the intelligence and the independence and the history and the dark past and the sharp edges, and finding it not challenging but compelling. Not in spite of those things, because of them. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the blanket. He turned his hand over and held hers. They did not speak. They did not need to. The fire settled in the stove and the snow lay deep around the small cabin and the stars overhead were out now, visible through the tiny window, and she did not navigate by them in that moment. She simply let them be beautiful. The ride to Cheyenne took 3 days. They found 2 horses at the ranch affiliated with the line cabin, a half-mile down the valley. The rancher there, a laconic man named Stoddard, who looked at them both with the particular frontier incuriosity of someone who had seen stranger combinations pass through his property, and provided them with mounts in exchange for a fair sum from Reuben's coat pocket, without asking questions that he clearly did not want the answers to. Those 3 days were a different kind of journey from the ones they had taken in irons and avalanche and blizzard. The warrant was still technically in force, and both of them knew it, and there was a formality to their travel that acknowledged this, a careful propriety. But between them the conversation continued, deepened, built itself into something with real structure and weight. They talked about what they believed and what they wanted and what they were afraid of. They talked about the law and its failures and its possibilities, and what a person could do, within and outside of it, when both were necessary. On the second evening, camped in a stand of cottonwoods beside a frozen creek, he read to her from the small journal she had noticed in his breast pocket. She had been right that it was significant. It was his case journal, but it was also, she discovered, something else. He had been writing in it for years, in the margins and on the blank pages at the back, observations and thoughts that were too complex and too personal for case notes. He read her a passage about a sunset over the Great Basin that was purely, unexpectedly beautiful writing, plain and precise and lit from within. She sat across the fire from him and listened to his voice reading his own words and felt something settle inside her that had been restless and unsettled for 6 years, something that located itself and went quiet. On the third day, as the low buildings of Cheyenne appeared in the afternoon distance, she said, "Whatever happens in that courtroom, Reuben, I want you to know that these 4 days have been something I will not forget. I have been many things since my father died. I have not been known. You have known me." He reined the horse slightly so they rode abreast and looked at her with the winter sun behind him making a gold outline of his hat and shoulders. "I am going to do everything in my power to ensure this ends well," he said. "I want you to have heard me say that clearly." "I have heard you," she said. "Good," he said, and what happens after the courtroom is also something I have been thinking about." She looked at him. "I have been thinking about it as well," she said. They rode into Cheyenne. The circuit court sat in February in the Laramie County Courthouse, a building that always smelled of wood polish and anxiety. Birdie had been held in Cheyenne for 3 weeks waiting for the sitting, and those 3 weeks were the strangest of her life. She was not treated harshly. Reuben Ashford had made specific, documented, formal requests regarding her treatment that left no room for the kind of informal cruelty that sometimes characterized custody in territorial towns. She had her father's instruments and her books. She was warm and fed and treated with a basic dignity that she had not expected. He had visited her 3 times formally, with the desk officer present as propriety required, and each visit had been brief and careful and had said more in its restraint than a longer conversation might have. He was building the case. He was working. She could see it in the focused clarity of him, the way he moved through the courthouse with a purpose that left no room for the procedural obstruction that certain interested parties were very clearly attempting to create. Because there were interested parties. There were men in the territory, men connected to the ring and to the land offices, and to the fraudulent claim operations that she had targeted over 4 years, who had a strong interest in ensuring that the proceedings against her remained narrow, focused on her specific crimes, and generated no broader evidentiary discussion of the context of those crimes. Reuben had anticipated this. His file was comprehensive and precisely structured, and when he presented it to the circuit judge on the first day of the hearing, the murmur that ran through the courtroom was audible and uncomfortable, particularly in the section where the interested parties were seated. Birdie sat at the defendant's table with a court-appointed attorney named Haggerty, who was young and nervous and clearly intimidated by the situation, but who had the good sense to let Reuben lead the contextual argument, because Reuben was the arresting officer and had standing to present the investigative record, and the investigative record was extraordinary. She sat straight-backed and still and watched Reuben work. He presented the file methodically and without drama, his voice carrying its characteristic low evenness, building the picture of Calvin Hearst survey findings and the suppression of those findings, and the trail of documents that connected the suppression to specific officials and specific financial interests. He presented the record of the fraudulent land claims, the families who had lost homesteads, the money that had moved from those families' pockets to the pockets of men who had suborned public officials to falsify records. He presented the documentation of what had been restored, carefully, and without naming her as the specific mechanism of restoration, but constructing the correlation clearly enough that anyone in the room could follow it. The judge, a man named Cardwell who had the reputation of being genuinely difficult to impress, was paying very close attention. The interested parties attempted to have the contextual file dismissed as irrelevant. Cardwell denied the motion. They attempted to challenge the chain of evidence. Cardwell dismissed that challenge with a specificity that suggested he had been watching this corner of the territory for some time and was not displeased to have a formal record developed. The hearing lasted 4 days. On the 4th day, Judge Cardwell sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the Laramie County Courthouse for what felt like a very long time, and then he looked at Birdie. She met his eyes. "Miss Hurst," he said, You have committed crimes that are documented and undeniable. You have also, as the record before this court makes clear, committed those crimes in a context of such extraordinary official failure and specific personal injury that the application of standard sentencing guidelines would require a deliberate blindness on the part of this court that I am not prepared to practice. He paused. I am also aware that the formal record you have helped to establish, through the investigative work of Deputy Marshal Ashford and through the trail your own actions have left, is going to have consequences for certain parties in this territory that are, frankly, long overdue. The interested parties section was very quiet. I am sentencing you to 2 years of supervised residency within the Wyoming territory, Cardwell said. You are prohibited from leaving the territory, required to report to the United States Marshal's office in Cheyenne on a monthly basis, and formally required to cooperate with the ongoing federal investigation into land fraud and document falsification in this territory, in which your direct knowledge and experience will apparently prove useful. He looked at her over his glasses. I would also suggest, in the strongest possible terms, that the skill set you have been applying to extralegal enterprises might find more useful and permanent application in the service of something that does not require you to be a fugitive. Birdie heard the blood in her own ears. She heard Haggerty exhale beside her. She heard, from across the courtroom, the sound of Reuben Ashford's controlled and characteristic silence, and she looked at him. He was looking at her with those amber eyes, and in them was something that was not triumph, not the satisfaction of a legal outcome achieved. It was simply warmth, deep and steady and entirely personal. She looked back at the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, and her voice was completely steady. It took a month for the Cheyenne winter to begin its grudging retreat toward spring, and in that month several things happened. The federal investigation that Cardwell had referenced developed significant momentum, drawing in investigators from outside the territory who were less susceptible to the interested parties' local networks of influence, and Birdie's specific knowledge of surveying practices, land claim documentation procedures, and the methods by which fraud was conducted and concealed, proved genuinely valuable in ways that Cardwell had correctly predicted. She worked on it with a focused satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of the extralegal years, cleaner and more permanent. Reuben was reassigned to the Cheyenne office for the duration of the investigation, which he had requested, and the investigation threw them together in a formal professional capacity that was both useful and a particular kind of exquisite restraint. They were colleagues in an official proceeding. They were careful and appropriate. They were also, in the evenings after the formal work was done, in the coffee houses and the open spaces of the small city, and on the longer rides that the early spring increasingly permitted, simply themselves. He had been right that what was on the other side of the formality was worth working toward. She had been right that something had shifted that she could not make unshift and did not want to. In the absence of the immediate extremity of blizzard and survival and arrest and trial, it did not diminish or simplify. It deepened and complicated itself in the way that real things do, acquiring texture and history, and the small ordinary dailiness that is the actual substance of a life shared. He brought her books he had found and thought she would appreciate, which she consistently did, because his judgment of what she would appreciate was disconcertingly accurate. She showed him the mathematical principles her father had developed for the modified compass navigation, working through them on paper at the table in the shared office space, and he was a genuinely good student, asking the right questions and building the understanding correctly. He told her about Tennessee and she listened, and one afternoon she said, simply, "Write your brother a proper letter, today. I will help you if you want help." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why today?" he asked. "Because today you have someone to tell him about," she said, and it was the most direct thing she had said about what they were, and she watched it land in him, watched the expression on his face open fully, and he said, "Yes, all right, today." They wrote the letter together. It was a good letter. Spring came fully in April, the mountains losing their snow in cascades and trickles, the valley greening with the specific urgent green of high-altitude spring. Birdie had been given, as part of the practical arrangements of her supervised residency, a small house on the eastern edge of Cheyenne, a former surveying station that was partly her choice and partly a joke between them about professional appropriateness. She was standing outside it one evening in late April watching the last of the sunset go gold and purple over the Laramie Range when she heard his horse on the road, and she turned and watched him come toward her, and thought about how quickly the heart's geography can be remapped by the presence of a single person who is genuinely paying attention. He dismounted and came to stand beside her, and they watched the last of the light together. "I wrote to my supervisor," he said after a while. "I have requested a permanent posting in the Cheyenne office." She looked at him. "You have been moving your entire adult life," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have found a reason to stop." She turned to face him fully. He was looking at her with that steady amber gaze, and the evening light was in his face. And she thought about a crack in a rock face on a mountain in a blizzard, about a small fire and salt jerky and coffee, and the beginning of something real. She thought about her father saying, "Find the fixed point first and everything else will introduce itself from there." She put her hand against his jaw, and he covered it with his own hand, and he said quietly and simply, "Birdie Hurst, I love you. I have been loving you since somewhere around day 7 of tracking you, and I would like very much to stop doing it quietly and alone." She laughed, that escaped genuine thing, and said, "Day 7. You were deeply inconvenient to me before you even spoke." "I know," he said. "I am sorry." "No, you are not," she said. "No," he said, smiling. "I am not." She kissed him then, in the last of the April sunset, outside the old surveying station in Cheyenne. And it was exactly what she had known it would be from the moment she had decided to know it. Clear and warm and honest, with nothing hidden in it and nothing held back. The kiss of two people who had said all the true things already and had nothing left to perform. The summer of 1882 was a good summer in the Wyoming Territory, one of those seasons that seemed to want to make up for all the winters. The investigation made progress, and then significant progress, and then in August a federal indictment came down against 7 individuals connected to the land fraud operation, including 2 men who had been directly involved in the suppression of Calvin Hurst's survey findings. The trial would take months. The outcome was not guaranteed. But the record existed now, formally and permanently, and Calvin Hurst's name was in it, and his findings were in it, and the truth of what he had done and what had been done to him was no longer a suppressed and hidden thing. Birdie had stood in Reuben's office when the indictments were filed and read through the list of names, and felt something release in her that she had been holding for 6 years, something that she had not realized was still contracted and braced against the world. It did not bring her father back. Nothing would bring him back. But the thing he had tried to do was done now, through a chain of events that included her own extra-legal years and her own dark choices, and the record was there, and the wrong men were named. She had cried then for the first time since the rooming house in Cheyenne in 1876, and Reuben had been there, and he had not tried to manage it or redirect it or offer anything except his presence, solid and quiet and entirely available. They were married in September. It was a small ceremony, because neither of them was a person who needed large ceremonies, and because the list of people they actually wanted present was short and real. Stoddard the rancher came down from the valley because they had sent him a letter, and he came with his wife and brought a gift of 2 good horses. Haggerty, the lawyer, came and surprised everyone, including himself, by making a genuinely moving toast. The federal investigator from the land fraud case came and shook Birdie's hand with a grip that conveyed actual respect. Reuben's supervisor from Cheyenne came and was more gracious than expected, having apparently decided that an officer who had single-handedly compiled a case that brought federal indictments against a significant territorial crime ring, and also, incidentally, brought to court a 4-year fugitive, was someone whose personal choices merited no criticism. No family from Tennessee came, because the letter had gone only recently and the distances were what they were. But a second letter had arrived from Reuben's brother Daniel, and it was a good letter, warm and curious and full of questions about the woman who had apparently changed everything. And they had read it together, and Reuben had written back with answers that were honest and complete and full in a way that his previous letters had never been. The judge who performed the ceremony was not Cardwell, who was on circuit elsewhere, but a quiet man named Pharaoh who read the words with a sincerity that made them mean something. And when he got to the part about facing trials and adversity together, Birdie and Reuben both knew that they had a particular and specific understanding of that phrase that most couples in front of a judge did not have. And they looked at each other with that knowledge between them, warm and private and entirely theirs. She wore a dress she had not owned before, deep blue wool, practical enough for frontier conditions and cut well enough for a ceremony, and he wore his good coat, and had made an effort with his hair that she found inexplicably endearing. He looked at her walking toward him with an expression that was entirely private and entirely open, and she thought, "This is a man who will never sell me out. This is a man who will never trade away what matters for what is convenient. This is a man who tracked me for 19 days because he was paying enough attention to know I was worth understanding, and that is the basis of everything." She stood beside him, and she said the words, and she meant every one of them. The winter of 1882 was a different kind of winter from the previous one. They were in the house together now, the former surveying station that Birdie had made genuinely livable through the summer months with the particular creative practicality she brought to everything. She had expanded her surveying work, taking on legitimate contract work for 3 ranching operations in the territory that needed accurate boundary surveys, using her father's methods with the modified compass navigation and the celestial calculation. And the results were accurate to a degree that developed, quietly and by reputation, a waiting list of clients. Reuben was in the office 3 days a week, and in the field the other 2, working cases that were more prosaic than the big investigation, but that he approached with the same steady thoroughness. He came home in the evenings and she cooked, because she had learned to cook with the same methodical competence she brought to everything, and they ate at the table in the warm kitchen and talked about their days with an ease and completeness that she had never imagined finding in another person. He had found, that first winter, her father's surveying journals in the box she kept under the bed, the ones she had carried with her for 6 years without opening, because she could not open them without the grief being too immediate. He had not opened them without permission but had asked, one evening, whether she would share them with him. She had taken them out and they had gone through them together, slowly, over several evenings, and the grief had been there, but it had been bearable in his company in a way it had never been alone. And the journals had become something else as well, a record of extraordinary scientific work that deserved acknowledgement. In February, Reuben sent a formal letter to the Department of the Interior, attaching copies of Calvin Hurst's survey documentation and the celestial navigation methods, citing their evidentiary basis in the land fraud case and their technical merit, and requesting that they be formally recognized in the federal surveying record. He had not told her he was doing this. He had done it because it was right, and because Calvin Hurst's work deserved to exist in the official record, and because Reuben Ashford was the kind of man who did the right thing without requiring an audience. She had found out about it from a Department of the Interior clerk who came to the house in March with formal papers acknowledging the survey contributions of Calvin Hurst, deceased, to the federal cartographic record, and noting the specific celestial navigation innovations detailed in his documentation. She had read the papers twice, standing in the cold doorway while the clerk waited patiently, and then she had thanked the clerk and closed the door and gone to find Reuben. He was in the back room that they had made into a study at the desk, writing something, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway and immediately understood from her expression what had happened. "You should have told me," she said, and her voice was unsteady. I was afraid it might not come through, he said. I did not want to give you hope and then have it fail. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the desk and put the papers in front of him. He read them and she watched him read them, and when he looked up his eyes were warm in a way that was entirely personal. He deserved it, Reuben said simply. She nodded. She could not speak quite yet. She put her hand over his on the desk and he held it, and they stayed like that for a while, in the quiet of the study with the March light coming in the window, and she said her father's name quietly and let it be spoken in a space where it was safe and recognized and honored. Thank you, she said. He was your father, Reuben said. That is enough reason for all of it. By autumn of 1883 she was pregnant, and the revelation came in the particular way of that period, which was to say that she was certain for several weeks before she told Reuben, partly because she wanted to be sure and partly because she was, in spite of everything, in spite of all the evidence of the last year that this man was safe to be vulnerable with, still the woman who had spent 6 years building excellent defenses. She told him on a Sunday evening in October, when the light was golden and the cottonwoods were turning, and they had been for a ride together into the hills east of town. He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something young and open and overwhelmed in the best possible sense, something that cracked the last of his own careful armor completely, and he said, "Birdie," in a voice that was not quite even. "Yes," she said. "In April, I think." He pulled her to him with a care and completeness that she felt from her head to her heels, and she let herself be held, fully and without reservation, which was something she had spent 6 years not allowing, and which felt, she discovered, like coming home to a home she had not known she was missing. "I am frightened," she said very quietly into his shoulder. "I know," he said, "I am too." "That is not reassuring," she said. "I know," he said. "I am going to be frightened and completely devoted, and both of those things are going to be true at once," she laughed. "That is actually somewhat reassuring," she said. "Good," he said. "I will work with it." The baby came in late April 1884, a boy, which Reuben received with a dazed joy that was entirely without the gendered preference that characterized many men of the time and place. He held the infant with the careful, specific attentiveness he brought to everything important, and the baby, whom they named Calvin for the obvious reason, looked up at his father with the unfocused gaze of the newborn and seemed, against all probability, to be paying close attention. Reuben held his son and looked at Birdie across the bed where she lay exhausted and replete and present, and said, "Hello, Calvin Ashford," in a voice that was thick with something, and she looked at both of them, the man and the child, and felt the completeness of it in every part of her. Her father's name going forward, in a different context, in a life she had not planned and could not have imagined from the room in Cheyenne in 1876. A life that had been built out of the hardest things and had produced, against all the dark and difficult probability, something real and warm and holy itself. They sent a letter to Tennessee that week with the news of Calvin's birth, and Daniel Ashford's response came 6 weeks later and was full of delight and questions and an invitation, warmly extended, to visit when travel permitted. Reuben read the letter at the kitchen table with Calvin asleep in the wooden cradle he had made himself from cottonwood and dried pine, and his expression was something she had never seen from him, a specific kind of peace. "We should go," she said. "In the summer, maybe, when he is old enough to travel." He looked up. "Tennessee," he said. "You have been running away from it for 12 years, she said. "I think you are done running." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think I am." "Good," she said. "I want to see where you grew up. I want to see the mountains you crossed to get here." "They are smaller than these," he said, with the particular fondness of a man speaking of something he knows is his whether or not it impresses. "All the better," she said. "I have had enough of large mountains in bad weather." He smiled. "I seem to recall you navigating one rather successfully." "I navigated it superbly," she said, "and I will remind you of that fact on a regular basis for the rest of our lives." "I expect nothing less," he said. They went to Tennessee that summer, Birdie and Reuben and Calvin, with the baby now 3 months old, and expressing opinions about travel with a volume and frequency that his parents found simultaneously exhausting and intensely charming. The journey took 3 weeks by rail and stage, which was a different kind of journey from blizzard and horseback, and Birdie watched the landscape change from high desert to plains to the green rolling hills of the east with the same attention she gave everything, reading the terrain, mapping it internally, noting the way different country expressed itself in different light. Daniel Ashford met them at the farm with his wife and 3 children, and an enthusiasm that was entirely genuine and somewhat overwhelming. And the reunion between the 2 brothers, 12 years in the making, was one of the things she would remember most clearly from that summer. The 2 men standing in the dusty yard with the farm behind them and the mountains in the distance, both of them taller than was strictly convenient, and the way Reuben's face did something it only ever did completely around people he had given his full trust to. She held Calvin on her hip and watched her husband be reunited with his family and felt the warmth of it as her own, which was how it was between them, which was the whole thing. Daniel's wife, a capable and forthright woman named Rachel, made Birdie feel immediately at home in a way that was entirely natural and required no effort from either of them. They were, it turned out, people of a similar quality of directness and practicality, and within a day they were talking across the kitchen table with the ease of long acquaintance. "He wrote about you," Rachel told her, on the second evening, when the men were outside with the children, and the fire was warm and Calvin was asleep in her arms. In the letter before the last one, he wrote about someone he was tracking, and he said he had not expected to find someone like that. He said the person was the most principled individual he had encountered in his work. Birdie looked down at her sleeping son. "He told me the same thing, more or less," she said. "He has never said that about anyone," Rachel said. "Reuben is a good man, but he does not give that kind of judgment easily." "No," Birdie said. "He does not." She paused. "Neither do I," Rachel smiled. "I know," she said. "That is very obvious." They stayed 3 weeks and left carrying a box of preserved fruit from the farm and a handmade quilt from Rachel and the specific warmth of having placed something in the world that had been unplaced for a long time. The years that followed had the quality of good things that are also real things, which is to say they were not frictionless or uncomplicated, but they were solid. The investigation into land fraud in the Wyoming Territory concluded in 1885, with convictions for 5 of the 7 indicted parties, a result that Reuben privately called partial but genuine progress and Birdie called better than nothing, which was her standard for evaluating institutional outcomes. 2 of the convicted men were connected, through a long chain of documentation that Birdie's 4 years of extralegal research had helped establish, to the network that had sold her father's location. She had stood outside the courthouse when the verdicts were read and breathed the October air and been aware of her father, not as the grief shape he had been for years, but as a presence, as someone who had done something that mattered and was now, in some partial and imperfect but real way, recognized. She had said nothing to Reuben about this. She did not need to. He had been beside her when the verdicts came down, and he had said nothing either, and in the silence between them was the full understanding of what it meant, and that was enough. The supervised residency requirement ended formally in 1884, a consequence of the completed investigation and the good offices of Judge Cardwell, who issued the formal termination with a brevity that was characteristic and entirely sufficient. Birdie was no longer technically a fugitive or a supervised resident, but simply a person, which she marked by a single quiet evening at home with Reuben and Calvin, eating a good meal and reading by the fire. "You are officially free," Reuben said, over the table. "I have been free for a while," she said, and she meant it in the way that mattered, the interior kind. He looked at her with those amber eyes and said, "Yes, you have." And she knew he meant the same thing she meant. Her surveying practice grew through the late 1880s into something that occupied her fully and satisfied her in the deep way that work satisfies when it is genuinely yours. She had 3 contracts with the Federal Land Office itself by 1887, a circumstance that struck her as the particular kind of irony that the world produced when it was paying attention to narrative structure. She trained 2 apprentices in her father's methods, young men who had come to her separately and independently because of the reputation her surveys had developed for accuracy, and she taught them the celestial navigation techniques and the snow reading and the magnetic field differential approach with the same patience and precision her father had given her. She dedicated the written version of her father's navigation methods, which she compiled and had printed in 1888, to Calvin Hurst, surveyor and astronomer, New Mexico Territory. The dedication was 2 sentences, plain and true. He taught me to find the fixed point first and let everything else in the sky introduce itself from there. This work is his, continued. Reuben had read the dedication in the printed copy when it came back from the printer and was quiet for a long time before he said, "He would have been very proud of you." "I think he would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," he said. "I have been doing my best to be worth it." "You are," she said simply. "You have been from the beginning." Calvin grew into a boy who was curious and quick and shared his grandmother's name, and as far as Birdie could tell, her father's quality of patient, delighted attention to the way things worked. He was 7 years old in 1891 when his sister came, a girl they named Frances after Reuben's own mother in Tennessee, and Calvin received her with the gravity and care of someone who had thought carefully about the responsibility and was prepared to take it seriously. Frances was, it became apparent within her first year, going to be a person of strong opinion and considerable force. She had Birdie's eyes and Reuben's jaw and a temper that seemed to be entirely her own invention, and she was going to be something, was how Reuben described it, and Birdie agreed. Something was not yet specified. It did not need to be. In 1893, Birdie Ashford, formerly Birdie Hurst, cartographer of the Wyoming Territory, received a formal letter from the Department of the Interior recognizing her surveying contributions, and specifically citing the development and application of Calvin Hurst's celestial navigation methods as a significant contribution to the federal surveying record. The letter was signed by an assistant commissioner whose name she did not know, and it used language that was appropriately bureaucratic and contained nothing personal. She read it at the kitchen table in the morning light while Calvin was at school and Frances was in the yard, and Reuben was drinking his coffee across the table from her. When she finished reading, she put the letter on the table and folded her hands over it and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. "All right?" Reuben asked. "Yes," she said. "Very much all right." She looked at him. "My father's name is in a federal record as a significant contribution to the surveying of this country. It is there permanently. It cannot be suppressed again." "No," Reuben said. "It cannot." She looked at him across the table, this man who had tracked her across 19 days of Wyoming winter and put irons on her, and also compiled a defense file for her, and presented the full truth to a court, and sent letters to government departments, and held her through grief, and built a cradle from cottonwood, and held her father's memory as carefully as he held her. This man who had said the true things plainly and had not run from the difficult ones and had built, over 12 years of marriage, a life with her that was solid to its foundations. "I would like to go for a ride today," she said. "The 2 of us. The children can manage an afternoon." He smiled, that full smile that still, after 12 years, did the same thing to her chest. "Where?" he asked. "Nowhere specific," she said. "I thought we would navigate as we go." He pushed his chair back and stood and extended his hand across the table. "Lead the way," he said. She took his hand. Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming morning was clear and bright, and the mountains were visible in the north, still carrying their snow even in late spring, white and absolute against the blue sky. The world was mapped and known and navigable and also always, endlessly, containing more than any fixed chart could hold. She had found the fixed point. Everything else had introduced itself from there. They rode out together into the morning, and the trail was open before them, and she knew where she was going, and he rode beside her, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was theirs.